what's your premise of Douglas and critical race theory from Rosalind? And my real summary, short summary of the article is, I've spent a long time in my career talking about slavery and talking about race. And I had never read critical race theory, okay? And I had not read critical race theory until the year 2021 when it became an issue. So I am not alone. Most people who do American history, the history of slavery, the history of race, do not do critical race theory. It's a wedge issue. And so when I saw how it was being used, I went and read some critical race theory and to see what I could learn and what it is. And what I learned is the critical race theory developed near the end of the 1960s, championed by some law professors during the civil rights movement, who argued, and they certainly have a good argument. I mean, people behind it are really intelligent and they have something to say, but it's not what we're all saying. But the argument was, we're getting rights and they're being co-opted by a system that is fundamentally racist. So we should stop talking about getting rights and we should start talking about undoing the whole system, which I think in the current moment in particular is going to be pretty hard to convince people from the heartlands that it's time to undo everything about the country because everything is racist and built on racist assumptions. So in my short piece on Douglas and critical race theory, which is easily available if you do an internet search on the Los Angeles Review of Books, it's very short. I look at how Douglas, throughout his life, continued to argue that it was important to fight for rights, particularly the right to vote. So I see Douglas, there are some aspects of Douglas in some moments we could say, yeah, that kind of shares that notion that we find in critical race theory, particularly when Douglas said that the Constitution was pro-slavery. But to kind of look back to that quote that I have from the end of Lessons of the Hour, and to look at a lot of Douglas's rhetoric, he is saying, I still want to fight for human rights. And in my piece, I look at some of the key works of critical race theory where the theorists say, that's a waste of time. And Douglas did not think that was a waste of time. We can have different opinions about that, but I think that Douglas would not have been totally aligned with critical race theory if he knew what it was. A lot of us didn't even know what it was until we saw that some politicians were saying everyone is teaching critical race theory. Most of us didn't know what it was, except for some people in law school. So it was an important part of law school. Some law schools, like at Harvard, for instance, but not all professors at Harvard. I think one thing I didn't have time to talk about is that when the 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870, giving Black men the right to vote, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and other women's rights feminists said to Douglas, you shouldn't support this because it's not allowing women to vote. And Douglas, who is aligned with Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and a whole bunch of feminists in the 19th century, had a one-year period where they're arguing with each other. And I think that Douglas's position was, men have the right to vote. I want Black men to be regarded as men. This is not the end of the struggle for women's rights. And in fact, he continues to go to women's rights conventions. You can find these debates online, and I think what's disturbing about them, and you find some feminists now saying, Douglas should have aligned himself with the white women reformers. But you read things from Susan B. Anthony and other white feminists, and they're saying things like, why should an uncultured, unintelligent Black man be given the vote over a woman who went to college? You know, this is absurd. And so there's some racism that's built into the discussion from their point of view. You know, from my point of view, no one is totally right, but I understand where Douglas was coming from. Men could vote. I want Black men to be regarded as men. That doesn't mean the struggle is over. Someone asked, what inspired you to work and write about Douglas? And there's a lot of things that inspired me, but it's a very good question. And I'll just say that my personal history is that I got a PhD at a university running from the late 1970s into the early 1980s. So I've been around where there weren't any Black writers on reading lists. I didn't even have to, on my PhD orals for the 19th century, I didn't have to read Douglas. It just wasn't being read. I ended up with the job at the University of Maryland. University of Maryland hired some really good African-Americanists. Mary Helen Washington and Carla Peterson are the better known people. I found myself interested in their work. I wanted to talk to them. I learned from them about a larger sense of 19th century American literature and culture. And of course, Douglas was also based in Maryland. So I think of him as kind of like a Marylander that we should learn about. And I started reading his newspapers and became fascinated by the whole historical context and kind of the larger issues connected to slavery and race that I did not encounter in graduate school. So when you have a long career, you're looking for things that reinvigorate you and excite you. So my first book was on Herman Melville, Nathaniel Hawthorne, James Fenimore Cooper, and Charles Brockden Brown, 4 white men. And I was going to keep writing about these kind of people. Then I got interested in something else. And the something else got me interested in approaching some of the major figures like Melville in a different sort of way, because Melville himself was interested in slavery and race. So it was part of being at Maryland. It was part of kind of picking up on what people were talking about and then just becoming fascinated by the history. And Julie Bottom says, let's just see. Okay. Actually, I'm having trouble reading all of the, let me see. Okay, what's your premise? Dr. Levine, please speak about why Douglas no longer referred to the Constitution as a racist document in 1850. That was before Reconstruction. I think it was a pragmatic move. And I think also it's part of that Douglas optimism that he didn't like the idea that we couldn't do politics. So Douglas became in the 1850s what historians call a political abolitionist, someone who wanted to make changes through political action. And you can't do that if you think that, or you wouldn't want to do that if you thought that the Constitution and the whole nation was corrupt. So he left Garrison and he made the politically pragmatic move to a philosophy that some historians now say isn't quite right, because there is a 3/5 clause in the Constitution that seems, in a way, to uphold the Southern position on slavery. It's like each slave that you own provides you with 3/5 representation in Congress. So you want a lot of enslaved people in the Southern states for greater representation. I think Douglas liked the idea of thinking about the Constitution as anti-slavery because it enabled him to embrace political action. And there are people like lawyers today who talk about the large intent or the spirit of the Constitution as opposed to the letter of the Constitution. So Douglas is aligned with that. So Elizabeth, I've lost some of my chat because I opened and closed it. Are there any other questions?
There's one question from Patrick that or from Julie, sorry, that I want to make sure that we get to, where she's asking about whether Douglas gave any commentary or spoke to anything involving Phyllis Wheatley or her career or publishing record.
Right. I haven't seen anything about Phyllis Wheatley. But I think if you look closely at Douglas's newspapers, you'd probably find some discussion. So the person who asked the question probably knows that Thomas Jefferson said that Phyllis Wheatley was a pathetic poet. And this was in his Notes on the State of Virginia, published in 1787. And that David Walker, a free Black in Boston, who published an appeal to the colored people of the United States and the world, said, she's a fine poet, and we concede Jefferson's racism in the attack on Phyllis Wheatley. So that kind of set up the argument, as I teach it to students, is between Thomas Jefferson and David Walker. The interesting thing about Douglas is he was a very wide reader. And you might have noticed when I put the frontispiece of My Bondage and My Freedom on screen, that the epigraph is not from David Walker, who had written Kill or Be Killed to the enslaved people in his appeal, but it's an epigraph from Samuel Coleridge, the English Romantic poet. Douglas's favorite writer was Charles Dickens. Douglas serialized Charles Dickens in his newspapers. So it's not like Douglas was saying, let's find all of the major Black writers who were being neglected. Douglas also really liked Harriet Beecher Stowe. And there's a whole tradition of African-American activists who hate Uncle Tom's Cabin because they think it's racist. I would say Douglas published about 20 pieces in his newspaper called Frederick Douglass's Paper, saying this is a great novel and it's doing important work for Black people because it's getting white people to feel for and sympathize with Black people. So I'm sorry, nothing specific about Wheatley that I know, but I wouldn't be surprised if you go through Douglass's paper, if you find some contributor who talks about Wheatley.